So let's see, last week we left off, you had gone to Peru, and there was the accident investigation, labor dispute, and Kippy got a job and a promotion in New Jersey. And then you left off in 1992 with the house here in Merritt Island, and I think you just touched on doing some work with NASA and things. So what was the transition from New Jersey, Peru to here?
Well, it was a fairly short transition. I went from the job in Peru. I got on with Flight Safety International. It was the company down in West Palm Beach, and instructed in the S-76 helicopter in 3 different models: the A model, the C, and the C plus, I think, and was a flight simulator operator basically. But I actually gave check rides to foreign students who came in from Australia and New Zealand. And
this was in South Florida.
West Palm.
West Palm.
Yeah. And I had put in a request with the company that was operating the contract for NASA, which at that time was EG&G, and got notification from them to come up, and I got hired and flew the Huey, which we had 3 or 4, and then the G1, which was a Gulfstream pressurized turbine engine fixed wing. And then later we got the G2, which was a jet, and the G3, which is just an improved model of the Gulfstream. And flew those until, I guess, 2005, somewhere in there. And then left that job.
And you were training the whole time on those? You were training other pilots on those, or you were flying?
I was flying NASA people.
Okay.
Like when Glen went up and did his return to space.
Yeah, I remember that.
Well, he was flying on the aircraft that Houston had, the G1 they had. We had the rest of the crew. And before we took off, I got off the aircraft and went over to the one that he was on and made everybody on board sign the card that they made up. Every launch they had a picture of all the astronauts and their position, whether they were the pilot or one of the engineers or payload specialist, whatever.
Nice.
And then we took that original and we had a bunch of copies made, so all of the people at Patrick there
Get a copy of that. That's awesome.
got a copy, so it worked out nice.
Yeah.
It was an interesting job. You got to fly the helicopter just about daily, flying around the Space Center, doing the security, carrying SWAT guys on board with machine guns, so that we had support in case something happened. And one particular time they had a bunch of Chinese immigrants, illegal, that landed on the beach, and I guess the guy who brought them I didn't get all the details, but he told everybody just kind of sit tight here and I'll go find transportation. And he did. He found an MP vehicle who immediately said, hey, you're not supposed to be here. And then they started looking, and we found 8 more Chinese illegal immigrants, and they picked them all up, and I don't know what happened to him after that, whether they took him down to put him to work or
Yeah.
what happened. But
Not a very good navigator, huh? Choosing that one particular stretch.
yeah, with all the beach in Florida to land on, he picked the wrong place. And
So you were there for 13 years?
from
92 to 2005, is that right?
No, actually, I hired on after flight safety. That was 1996. And I remember on several occasions when they'd have the shuttle go up, people would be flying around locally and decide to get close to watch the launch. And as soon as they came in the airspace, the launch center would shut down the countdown. So we'd have to go try and find them and run them out so we could launch. And one particular launch we had, the chief pilot and myself were flying, and we had an airplane, a little Cessna 172, that kept coming into the airspace. So every time we got within like 5 minutes of launch, he would be in the airspace and they would stop the countdown. So finally, after about the third time, the chief pilot, Norbert Violette, who just passed away recently, he pulled in a armload of collective and we climbed up there and pulled up right alongside the guy. And we got the SWAT guys with machine guns in the side door. I saw him look out and then he banked out and never came back in the airspace after that.
Jeez. Did you guys have to do any work offshore as well, like with boats and things? Or were you just on the land and the airspace?
Mainly on land.
Yeah.
We had to, well, they had Coast Guard and they had, I guess, recovery ships out on the ocean, so
Yeah.
we didn't cover that much.
You in the air to see some launches from the air?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty cool, huh? It's a great view.
It was, and several times we were right within a mile of the launch.
Wow.
And they had armored personnel carriers. And we'd sit in them and wait till after the blast and then come out and watch as it went around. The coolest thing was actually watching it land.
Yeah.
The launch, you could see that on TV.
Yeah.
And they show it over and over, but we were all at operations on the shuttle landing facility when one of the shuttles came back into land, and then it was kind of eerie because it's basically a glider and it comes overhead at 100,000 feet, and when it makes the turn to start its traffic pattern, so to speak, there's a sonic boom.
It's a double, right?
And
Boom,
it's a
boom.
boom boom,
Yeah.
and then we could actually see it, and we're watching, and then we kind of lost sight of it, and then all of a sudden you can see it on final approach, and it's coming in and not making any noise at all,
The hauling ass.
and there's no gear down, and then finally, just, I don't know, maybe a quarter of a mile from landing, the gear comes down, a slight flare, and lands and rolls out forever.
Yeah, and the parachutes, right? Had the parachutes to slow it down.
Parachute comes out.
I never saw one. Like, I always looked and I heard the booms, but by the time I heard the booms, it was probably on the ground from Rhode Island, wasn't it?
I think it was like they could count down 33 seconds or something like that. It was pretty precise.
I can remember sitting out in the ocean surfing when it would land out west, and they would fly it back
Yeah.
And it'd be piggyback, and they'd fly real slow over the coast. Everybody get a good look at it, and that was cool. I missed that.
Yeah, I was actually flying one day when they were repositioning two aircraft. The Atlantis and Columbia had flown, and both of them had to land out west, and so they put them on the 747 and flew them back in. And Atlantis landed on the main shuttle landing facility, and it rolls out all the way just about to the end. I mean, they could have stopped shorter, I guess, but a 747 does take a little ways to land.
Yeah.
And then they would bring it back in, and at the operations building, they had a big facility where they pull the aircraft up into it and then attach onto the space shuttle and put the gear down, and then they disconnect from the 747, pull the 747 out of the way, and then drop the shuttle down on its main gear, and then just tow it away over to the shed where they park them, the hangars. And the second aircraft with the Columbia on board was, I guess it didn't encounter some expected weather, so it got there before Atlantis had been pulled off of the runway. So we were watching, and we were over at the other landing strip. I'm trying to remember the name of it now. But it wasn't quite as long as the main strip, and it was over very close to the beach. And he came in and landed, and by the time he stopped at the end of the runway, you could see the Atlantis. I was hovering at a high hover. I didn't have a camera, naturally I was flying, but the Atlantis, they were just towing it off of the runway. And you had Atlantis and Columbia all in the same frame there.
Yeah. The shuttle, once it landed, it had no autonomous maneuvering power, right? The wheels and all were just fixed for glider landing, right? Or was it able to maneuver on its own, do you know?
Well, it had nose gear, so they could
steer, but not like
it didn't have
couldn't drive itself
no,
at all.
it didn't have
had to
any
be
power.
towed. Yeah.
So they always towed it around.
Yeah.
But it was quite an interesting job.
Yeah. And so you did that until 2005?
Mm-hmm.
And did you retire at that point, or did you go on to something else?
I went on to being unemployed.
Yeah.
And we went out to Reno for a Air America reunion, and I was talking to a friend of mine, and he had a twin-engine airplane that he would loan out every year to a company in Cedar City, Utah, that did firefighting. They'd go up and they would not drop the detergent or whatever on the fires, but they would get in there and be a spotter and direct the aircraft to where the fire was or where they needed some help. And so he gave me a job, said, you know, if you'll check out on this aircraft, I'll let you fly the contract for the summer, or the fire season, whatever it turned out to be. So Kippy and I drove down to San Diego, where he lived, Santa Ana, really. And excuse me. So I got in his little Aero Commander twin engine, And the Czech airman was the pilot for Carroll Shelby, and was based out of, actually I think he flew for Carroll Shelby out of Las Vegas, but he was a instructor, so he was gonna check me out, and I got about 20 hours in the aircraft, and then flew the aircraft to Cedar City, Utah, and got with the guy who was working in the
Bless you.
in the mountains up just to the east of Cedar City. It was Cullub or something like that, the name of the company that he had. And flew with him over to park the aircraft at St. George, where my brother-in-law and sister were, they lived in St. George. Well, both of them lived there at that time. And
Did he fly with you on these
No.
trips? No.
now this was one of the very few jobs that she didn't follow me.
Yeah.
Otherwise, for the most part, she was the genuine bona fide camp follower. She followed me everywhere. But I landed in St. George, and we parked the aircraft, and then, as it turned out, the fire season was a very uneventful season, and the guy who I delivered the aircraft to, he flew any missions that they had, which was very few, and so I just visited with my sisters-in-law and my brothers-in-law, and
You just on call, like.
well, I
kinda-
stayed there for about a week, waiting
Okay.
for, he was trying to find, or trying to get the contract, or any firefighting that was gonna come up, and it was just so little that he decided he didn't need a pilot for the aircraft, he would just fly it himself. So after about a week, then I just flew back to Florida, and
Is that 2006 or still 2005? Do you think?
2005, yeah.
And so you're back in Florida in the house over on Merritt Island.
Yeah. Over on Martin Boulevard. That was pretty much the end of my flying career there. I didn't fly anymore, just played golf and had breakfast on Saturday mornings with the Air America guys.
Yeah.
I think at that time we had 22 Air America or ex-Air America guys who lived close in and would come to breakfast. We'd go out to Turtle Creek and have the breakfast out there and tell war stories, and they got better every time. Some of them were even true.
All right. So looking back in the whole span of your flying career, is there a period that stands out the most to you, the one that you enjoyed the most, or you're most proud of, or was most exciting? Is there a high point for you in your flying career?
Well, in that respect, I think possibly the period when I was in Special Forces was more exciting, and I did more challenging things, walking up and down the Mount Olympus in Greece during the fall maneuver in 1962 3 times, and 5 days. That was quite a challenge. But the submariner, or getting off a sub and, you know, deploying like the SEALs do now, that was a great adventure, you would say. We were using our canteens to get the water out of the boat so it didn't sink, and jumping out of airplanes, and the language school, the mission over to Laos in 1960. That was, I'm finding out now that I really was not aware of what was going on. I mean,
politically and geopolitically and what it all meant.
well, a good friend from Air America has written all about it, and he goes back all the way to 1949 when Air America was Civil Air Transport and some other names, because the Chinese owned the certificate. And the CIA was using Air America Civil Air Transport to fight the communists. And
supporting Chiang Kai-shek?
yeah,
Is that right?
and they did a lot of work bringing people from the mainland to Taiwan, and several instances, you know, where people were shot down, or on landing they were killed because the information they had was not good. And then the airdrops into Dien Bien Phu in 1954 or 5.
Supporting the French?
Yeah. They had Air America pilots flying the C-119, they called it the flying boxcar, but they were dropping ammunition into the fort at Dien Bien Phu because they were all surrounded. And you know, after the second or third day, the bad guys had all the anti-aircraft in position, and when they went in and did their drops, it was to their peril. There was a lot of anti-aircraft fire, and they shot down the one in particular that crashed in Laos. And one of the pilots, his nickname was Earthquake Magoon, and that wasn't his real name, that was just a nickname. But he was quite an interesting character. And I'm finding out now, reading the memoirs that Dick Casterland wrote in his books, and he wrote 15 books. He's been writing them ever since, I guess, he left Air America in '74. But the bad guys, when we were up on the Plains de Jars, were completely in control of everything except right there on the Plains de Jars where we were. And anytime they wanted to, they could have come down. I mean, it was like, an hour drive.
Yeah, they had the numbers and equipment.
Yeah, they had everything that they needed if they would have wanted to. But I guess our training, a company-sized unit in how to shoot a weapon and tactics and whatever, just, it wasn't that important to them. And the whole mission was basically to train the guerrillas so that would take some of the pressure off of the main fighting force down in South Vietnam. And they'd have to, instead of everybody headed south with ammunition and reinforcements, they'd have to divert somebody over to mess with
split it up a little bit.
Yeah, these Lao guerrillas that were giving them a hard time. And
do you remember, from your perspective at that time, maybe what you thought was going on there compared to what actually was? when you
Yeah,
learned more?
I do, and that was what really brought my attention to what Dick was writing, because when we were there, it seemed so safe and secure that one night in particular we would alternate weekends where we'd interact with the International Voluntary Service, which was another agency that was trying to help them make the soil more fertile by rotating crops. They brought in a Brahma bull to breed with the local cows because they were just little runty cows. And I rode around with one of the guys on a weekend, and when I got back up to the team house that night, the team leader, he was really upset and was going to court-martial me for being AWOL. And I was thinking, what's the big deal? We were just driving around on the PDJ and looking at everything, and I'd been out hunting ducks before and the little quail and stuff like that, so I didn't see any danger or whatever. So now I'm finding out that with the bad guys, they were right, within 50, 60 miles, and they could have come down, and if they would have cut me off somewhere and captured me, then I didn't have a proper identification. I had a fake ID card, so they could have shot me as a mercenary, and nobody
He would have been responsible for you.
Yeah.
So it rolls downhill.
And he would have been held responsible for me not being there or getting captured. And then we had a different situation in Vietnam, and I have the pictures that I have up on the wall of the mountain yards. And I think about, we had these people, naive little guys who, with their little crossbows and bow and arrow, would take care of themselves and provide food for the families, but they weren't capable of holding off the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong guerrillas, whoever came up against them. They would just pack up and kind of move.
Yeah.
And somehow or other, someone, I guess, in the State Department or Department of Defense thought it would be a good idea to arm them and train them and help them build up the fortifications around their villages, and thought that that was a good idea and that they'd be able to defend themselves. So that's just a pretty stupid idea, and I don't even know to this day what happened to them. I know the last time that I had any interaction with them, the case operator who was there was a guy named Ed Sprague, who I'd been in special forces with. And he was the only person there from the US who was doing anything for them and trying to help them. And the guy in Da Nang, Pete Petrie, I also knew from Special Forces. He was with the agency at that time. And so he had tried to get in contact with Sprague and tell him to get out of there because it was going to go bad real soon. And he said he wasn't leaving them. He had told these people that he was going to help, so he was going to stay. and told Pete not to send anybody else out there or he was gonna shoot him. Well, I knew him, so
He had that kind of autonomy, even working under the CIA?
he was the only guy in town,
Yeah.
so, you know,
He was the boss.
he had all the control, and I went out there and they built the huts up off of the ground, mainly because of the rainy season. But it wasn't that far off the ground, and being tall, I had to duck over quite a bit to get back into where he was at. And he recognized me from years before. So we talked for a while. I told him that, you know, my perspective was that the country was going to fall quite soon. And Pete, his immediate superior, basically wanted him to get on the helicopter and come out with me. And he said he wasn't going to do that. And so we talked for a little while longer and had a cup of tea, and then he said, when you leave, don't come back.
Yeah.
So I carried that message back to Da Nang, to Pete Petrie, and I've thought, you know, often whatever happened to him, if he stayed, I'm sure you can't escape and evade for 10, 20 years.
Yeah.
Sooner or later, the bad guys are going to get you. And they were in control the whole time. I know a little later I had a different mission with the ICCS working out of Pleiku in the Central Islands. And the International Commission was made up of Polacks and Indonesians and one other country. And we would leave Pleiku, and it was very strict and structured, and you had to leave a specific time and going in a specific direction, get over the main road, climb up to 6,000 feet, stay right over the road, go up to Kon and then land at Kon and pick up the interpreter, who was a North Vietnamese on a radio, Fox Mike, FM radio, and then take off, climb back up to 6,000 feet, fly directly over the road up to Dak To, and then from Dak To, follow the road out to the west to Lam Son, which was the Special Forces camp, excuse me, that was overrun, in the early 70s, I guess.
Just on the border?
It was right on the Cambodian
Yeah.
border. And when we got there, we had to be exactly 6,000 feet over the road and let down straight in, regardless of the wind, no turns, straight in and land on the little dirt strip, and then just shut down. Couldn't deviate.
Because the security perimeter was so tight that they could
Because
kind
they
of
said-
protect you that far?
They said they would shoot us down.
Yeah.
You know, we deviated, got off the road. And they had already shot down one Air America aircraft a couple of years previous, I guess, and killed the crew of the one aircraft, and the second aircraft just landed because of the heavy fire they were taking. But we landed, and a Jeep came out, and these NVA soldiers got out of the Jeep, took passengers. We had a Polak and Indonesian guy, and took them somewhere. We never saw him for about half an hour or so. And a little lieutenant from the North Vietnamese Army with his little pith helmet on, he took us over to a little thatch hut and offered us cigarettes and talked to us in perfect English for the period of time that the customer was gone. Then when they came back, our instructions were take off, turn, and go back over the road, climb up to 6,000 feet, stay over the road till we got to Dock Toe, and then turn south and stay over the road at 6,000 feet and go back into Kontum, drop this guy off. And I mean, they were deadly serious.
Yeah. So you didn't fly during Dien Bien Phu. You came over
No.
several years after all that happened,
I
correct?
joined the Army in '56, so it was
Right after,
Dien Bien Phu.
But that was the turning point, the handoff from the French to the Americans and the slow, gradual involvement of America after that, right?
Well, somewhere in there, the Geneva Accords from 1954 to '56, the U.S. Army was trying to, or not the Army so much as State Department and Department of Defense was trying to figure out what their strategy was going to be. They had already found out from the French losing their positions in North Vietnam and the Trail of Tears down the road there, that the French really couldn't control the country like they had when it was a colony.
Yeah.
And they had already decided that they didn't want to support Ho Chi Minh, who was the unelected but actual leader of North Vietnam. So he, in turn, got support from China and from Russia and used those resources to go ahead and push the French back south. And then when the Geneva Accords established separation of the country, they really didn't want to do that, but at that time we were the big dogs, so to speak. We had the clout and we still supported the French, so they decided they would put up with the separation. We actually had flights where they took people from North Vietnam down to South Vietnam because they were of different faith or whatever their decision was to leave the North. And the French, I think, probably even till today felt like, you know, this was a French colony and they should be able to maintain their assets. Like they had rubber plantations and they had other resources like tea and stuff, that plantations that they felt should remain theirs, and they didn't feel like they had to leave until the South Vietnamese hurried out there to the boats and left. And they'd already started the Michelin plantations that were already decimated and everything, so there wasn't a whole lot of French control left. But the US, I think, just they made their choice, and then once they decided, they figured they had to kind of stick with it. And Dick Casterman, in his books, he kind of relates, you know, State Department letters and instructions to the ambassadors and all of the interaction with the different departments of the government, and they just they never fully comprehended, I guess, the effect of communism. They knew that they didn't want to have a communist bloc there. That's why the Geneva Accords was able to make a separate Vietnam, North and South, and Laos and Cambodia. They were separate countries instead of just Indochina like they had been before.
Yeah.
But they really had no way, or I don't think they were really concerned about trying to administer the places like they did, because they had different information that things were going on and just didn't want to do anything about it.
Yeah.
Until it got to the point that he couldn't ignore it anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, when we left in December of 1960, got on the Air America airplane and flew back to Bangkok, and then flew back to the States. And by then, the bad guys had decided, well, it's time to take over the Plains de Jars, and so they just came down, and everybody had already repositioned down to the airfield, and Air America came in, picked them up, and took them out, and that was just about well, we never got back out onto the Plains de Jars until I think like 1969.
Was it actually occupied then, or just bombed and fighting?
Well, they took over and just run all the local people off into the mountains. They moved up into the hills, and the bad guys didn't have to or didn't want to follow them, so they would hold the ground down at the Plains de Jars, and the Mayo and Hmong and other hill tribes, they would hold the positions up in the hills.
Yeah.
And they had Air America support and rice drops and ammunition and so forth would be dropped into the people up in the hills. But the bad guys just were content to hold the plains.
Yeah.
And
there's probably no value up in the mountains, right? There's no reason to go up and fight those people if they.
No, and I guess a lot of it, at least according to Dick, had to do with the religious beliefs. The different tribes, didn't really believe in killing each other. So the philosophy was more or less bend like the willow and fight another day.
Yeah.
Why should I shoot you when I'm not really interested in holding your position or anything? I'll just move out of the way and stay out of range, and we'll see what happens tomorrow.
Yeah. So when you left in 1960, did you have an inkling that things were going to grow and get worse, or did you think maybe there would just be a gradual pullout and a stabilization?
No, I think at that time I had so little information, really.
Yeah.
They didn't really tell us what was going on, and I kind of felt like what we were doing was helping the people hold their ground, not necessarily, mount a offensive into North Vietnam or cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. I mean,
keep them safe in place and
just be able
allow
to
things to change.
stay there.
Yeah.
But then, that proved to be not very effective. The time we were there, just north of us was a province called Sam Nuya, and they were completely encircled, and pretty soon they were starting to run out of arms and ammunition, so Air America was going in and doing airdrops. And I actually rode on one of the airdrops and got to see the unique technique that they used for dropping the rice into these different locations. Because they started out with 100-kilo bag of rice, then they would take out 20 pounds or 20 kilos and sew it back up and put that in another bag and sew that up and then put it in another bag. So you had what used to be 100 kilos was now 80, but it was triple bagged.
Not as densely packed, right? So
Yeah.
everyone would flop to it, like a bean bag.
Well, and they piled them up on pallets and then would just roll them up to the door. And I was laying on the floor watching while we flew over the drop zone, and the pilot gave the green light. We kicked the pallet out, and all the bags were individual 80-pound or 80-kilo bags. So they just separated, and they're free falling, kind of a falling leaf effect, and start hitting the drop zone. And I remember watching, and there was a cow that somehow or other had wandered out onto the field, and that 80-kilo sack of rice took that cow out. I mean, it wiped it out.
Yeah.
It
What kind of altitude were they dropped? Were they kicking them at?
oh, maybe 1,000 feet.
Yeah.
It was well within small arms range.
Yeah, pretty close, huh?
Yeah. I remember seeing quite a few sparkles from the ground. It was just about dusk.
Yeah.
But the animals, not the cows, they were dumber than dirt, but the pigs, they learned to recognize the difference in the engines of the different aircraft.
Yeah.
And they only used the C-46, which had a big radial engine, to drop rice. And the C-47s and the Caribous had smaller engines, but they were radial engines also. And they used those to drop the ammunition in rifles. And I guess grenades and stuff like that too. But the pigs, you'd see them down there and just laying in the mud in the shade, just cooling it. And caribou would come in and fly over, and they didn't move. C-47 come in and fly over, and they didn't move. And the C-46, as soon as they heard that noise, they were up and headed for the drop zone.
Isn't that amazing?
In case, you know, one of the bags hit a stump or something and ruptured, they were right there.
Yeah.
They're amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing how smart pigs can be, man. All right, so that was still in Laos. During that period, do you have any other memories that jump out, things that of interest or things that maybe you hadn't touched on before? You were not chief pilot during that time, right? You were flying co-pilot a lot of the time and still learning?
Well,
if I
when
remember
we
that
were on
correctly?
the mission in Laos, I was a sergeant in Special Forces. I was the demolition supervisor. But I don't know if I told you about when they delivered my demolitions to me, because we didn't have anything to do with the packing or gear. It was all pre-packed and preloaded for us, and then put on a C-125, 124. And
Because you were training people in explosives at that period of time.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
And they loved it. None of them, or very few of them, could even read and write.
Mhm.
So it if you're talking about the Corps of Engineer formula on how to blow up a bridge abutment or something like that, if the person can't even read and write or count any more than 10, you've got to improvise. So I would teach them to take a piece of cord or a rope or whatever and put it around the abutment, and then take and put a stick of dynamite around the cord all the way, and then when they would go in to blow up the abutment, just to hook it up all the way around with detonating cord, connecting each block of TNT or dynamite, and then it was more than enough.
Yeah, do the trick.
But my opinion was, more was better than less, and so we'd make explosives to stop maybe a raiding party from advancing. We didn't have the claymore mines like they have now.
With the shrapnel inside and BBs.
Yes, place towards enemy.
Give you the direction.
Yeah. So I'd teach them to make up different charges and try and get some type of direction.
Was it a C4 type of explosive? Something that was moldable and pliable and very easy to work with?
Yeah, it was C4. And the first delivery I got, though, was all satchel charges. And I had no idea that they shipped this stupid stuff over like that, because there was 400 pounds of C3, and each satchel charge was 20 pounds, and every one of them had a non-electric blasting cap primed, all ready to detonate. And if somebody would have, like me, I'm standing there as this Jeep just kind of dumped this 400 pounds onto the ground. So I got my big screwdriver and hammer, and I'm prying the top open.
You could have set the whole thing off.
I could have set the whole thing off, and would have been a smear on the landscape. It'd been like a 400-pound bomb going off right there. But I didn't have any control over it, but I did forward that information down to the C team to let them know that this was a situation that was pretty dangerous, and that maybe they ought to have the Air Force reconsider.
Especially for training, right? I mean, if you're maybe dropping something into an active battle zone, you need it primed, so you use it right away. But when you're training people,
yeah, and when they had a C-124 that disappeared on one of those flights, and I've wondered to this day if possibly that's what happened, that one of the crates the aircraft got in turbulence or whatever, and the crate tipped over and detonated.
Nothing left of it. No.
That would make an airplane go missing, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But the people up in that area, we were Americans, and we weren't all tall like me, but the locals were quite short. I mean, 5 foot was probably a good average. Yeah. And there was no way that we could pass ourselves off as, the locals. So prior to that, our whole mission in Special Forces was to go behind enemy lines and train and equip the local guerrillas on how to conduct the war. And so now we're in a completely different configuration. We're there as advisors with a fake ID card in shorts and Australian bush cap, and they knew, everybody knew that we were American soldiers. And the French, the Foreign Legion, all those guys were from different countries. We had them from Guatemala, from another one was somewhere in the Caribbean, so a couple of guys from Nigeria or whatever.
Yeah, Morocco too, huh? The French Foreign Legion, yeah.
So the Legion guys, they were in uniform, and they did have some legality because the Geneva Accords said that they could be there and do what they were doing. But we were completely illegal and could have been shot if we were captured.
Were the French actively engaged in fighting at this time in Laos, or were they also training, but maybe
They
a little
were
more
only
directly?
training,
Yeah.
and they had their teams, and they were, I think, in contact with their headquarters with the ICCS or
Back in Vietnam.
whoever. And in Hanoi, they had people in Hanoi, I'm sure, that were in charge of everything that was going on.
No.
But going back after so many years, and everything kind of looked the same, except for some new aircraft that were shot down, and a carcass out there on the Place de Jars, and then all of the bomb holes from, I guess the word was more or less with the Air Force that if they came out of North Vietnam and didn't drop all of their ordnance, that they would go to the Place de Jars, and it was unfriendly, so they would drop their ordnance there. But I think they're still trying to clean up all the bombs and all the mines, and they weren't very careful about setting up their minefields either. They just kind of
Willy-nilly.
put them out and hope that that would keep the bad guys from overrunning them. And then when they pulled out, who knows?
Yeah, it wasn't an organized affair, was it? Yeah. Well, we've got about an hour in today.